Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You're really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me. Welcome to the podcast, Ronnie.
Well, thank you, Jason.
Your book is American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Tell us about it.
Well, when you ask that question, do you mean content or the origin of the book, or
the content? Yeah, the general, the overview of the book. It's you've touched on many topics in this, but the general pitch on your book.
It's 4 centuries of American esotericism, beginning with an exploration of the indigenous traditions, and then coming up through the time of the trappers and colonization, all the way up into present times. It's based on the most recent research in a relatively new field of academia, where the title comes from. It's referred to as American Metaphysical Religion, with the M and the R of metaphysical religion usually small. So I wanted to survey all of this new research and make it available to people who might not otherwise know that it was there or have access to it.
Got it. So that brings up a lot of questions. The first one I'm going to ask, and I want to go through and touch on the major periods of American metaphysical history. But the first thing I want to ask is there something special about America that puts it apart in terms of experimental religion from the rest of the world? Whether that's the fact that it's a melting pot, the indigenous influence, the fact that it was religious, cultists that were kicked out of Europe that came here to found it. What is your take on that?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a matter of degrees, because I believe there are other nations that have been and continue to be religious melting pots of a significant number of spiritual traditions. I do think that America is unique in the sense that everyone that arrived here, even the indigenous people, did not really originate here, apparently. At least that's what the research seems to be showing so far. And those that came here, as you just pointed out, were often fleeing governments or traditions that they found to be somehow blocking the truth instead of helping them find it. Also in America, because people were able to go off into the wilderness and start new communities, there was more of a willingness to go off somewhere where you could be yourself. And there's a new book actually out by Catherine Albanese, who's one of the academics who's really laid the groundwork for this field of study. And her book is about the pursuit of happiness and how, in a sense, in a very real sense, it has defined a new approach to religion that could be described as American.
So when you say that, I think of the kind of Tony Robbins prosperity gospel, or what's that guy's name? Joel Osteen type approach. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
I think that includes it, but it's much broader than that. It includes all the various traditions of sort of do-it-yourself, get in harmony with nature or divinity, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and make a better life for yourself philosophies. And so it can comprise anything from magical practice to Christian evangelical prosperity gospel. But the idea being that rather than the real traditional patriarchal monotheism idea of life as being challenging and filled with traps and suffering, and certainly these traditions have also had their ecstatic traditions that we're seeking to find a different approach to living life, and even millennial kinds of approaches where the belief came about, often practiced in America, that paradise was here now, but we had not recognized it. And I think in America, that kind of wishful thinking on a level, you might call it, or at least maybe that's like one side of it. On the other side of it, it is a laudable and honorable independent approach to finding what speaks to you spiritually, evolving yourself, and achieving the kind of life and community that is desired.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, America is very much a place where, you have to make your own way by hook or by crook. And I think any advantage people can get, they will take. And so, of course, they're going to, I guess, on one hand, look to metaphysics possibly more practically than other places in the world, but also, I think in America, the onus is on everybody to determine their own truth in a way.
I think that's true. I think that there's a split in the country that was there from the earliest colonial times between the esoteric side, which almost has existed as a shadow for America, but has been very influential, very popular. It arrived here with the earliest colonists. And when you consider something like the example of John Winthrop at the Massachusetts Bay Colony being the first governor and the real force in pilgrim politics and religiosity, and then his son, John Winthrop the Younger, is putting D's Monas hieroglyphics on his crates that are being shipped to America, many of which have books that once belonged to John Dee in them, and then eventually goes on to be the first governor of Connecticut colony, and a famous alchemist of the time who put to work Rosicrucian principles in many ways, even though when he went to Europe looking for Rosicrucians, he didn't find any. So here, even at the heart of this first American pilgrim colony, we find an esotericist who goes off to create a territory where there's more freedom for that kind of thing, and also became a famous doctor, more or less in the Paracelsian tradition in the area.
Well, let's start off there then, and actually mainly because this is the part that interests me the most. The influence of Rosicrucianism and the Western esoteric tradition on, I was going to say, the formation of America and its ideals, but possibly even its colonization, if you want to talk about that. That is super interesting to me.
Oh, okay. Well, I got some great news today, which was that a book that I just finished that has the tentative title, Rosicrucian Origins in Context. I think Intertraditions is going to buy it.
Great.
So that will be coming out. My take on it, again, based on the latest research, is that I do think it was extremely influential. And my take on it is that what we're dealing with, however, is not so much esoteric societies of initiated masters in the beginning. I really wonder, I don't know if we'll ever know the origin of the manifestos, who really wrote them, and those kinds of questions, and who are really the quote unquote Rosicrucians. Even defining Rosicrucian is so difficult because for many it's a name that is taken up or is used to accuse someone else or to praise someone else. The idea that a Rosicrucian is some sort of a special, unique sort of an individual flies in the face of the people who were influenced by Rosicrucianism and in a way may be said to represent it. So for instance, again, going back to John Winthrop the Younger, he wanted to be a Rosicrucian. He went looking for Rosicrucians. He couldn't find any. And then he decided to apply the principles in his own life. And so he healed people for free where he could. He provided medicines. He organized a small army of nurses who he trained to diagnose and to dispense different medicines that he had in different colored packets. And he was very concerned with protecting the weak and forwarding knowledge and really applying the ideas in the manifestos to governing the territory as best he could. So is he a Rosicrucian? I would argue that he is, that he, by embodying these ideals, he becomes that, even if he didn't have the official diploma of initiation like somebody like Sigismund Backstrom had one. But we don't, what does that mean anyway? Is it a Freemasonic society that gave him that diploma of initiation? We don't know. And so when I look at Andre, the young Andre, who may have been involved or have even authored these things, I see somebody who reminds me of almost like people like Ginsberg and Kerouac and Guy Debord, who was influenced by the Rosicrucians, who are young, filled with passion. I think that they were sort of drunk on Campanella and on all the ideas that were flying around in the wake of Dee and Bruno. And also, I think that the impending marriage and then the marriage of England and the Palatinate with Frederick and Elizabeth had people really thinking that there was the possibility to have a Protestant Holy Roman Emperor and break the power of the Roman Catholic Church once and for all. And so in a college surrounded by esotericists who were mentoring him, this work that he later called a ludibrium, a satire or a lampoon, comes together. And in some ways, it strikes me as this combination of political pamphlet. It would have fit into almost some of it into the 1960s with the way that it's attacking authority and predicting a new age, and it's going to be built on all the best of humanity and science. And it's speaking this sort of double language that leaves us wondering, is it apocalyptic like so much of Rosicrucian mysticism and of even Christianity at the time was? Or is this apocalyptic language simply a way of talking about revolutionary political concepts like getting rid of the Pope and not being so blatant about it that you were attracting big trouble? I think the book was basically, the Fama was meant to inspire people in their unique corners of their world to take up the universal Reformation. I think that there were many people around who were reading the same books. Were reading Agrippa and were reading the Hermetic tradition was blossoming in a sense at this time, and Ficino was being read again. And I think that it was all of a sudden this anonymous book comes about. You might see it first in manuscript, and you're going to say, that's me. This is my ilk. I'm one of whatever they are. I'm this, because this is the stuff I believe. I do these things. I read these books. I know what they're talking about. And I think the intention was that one should turn around in their own town, in their own world, and put these principles to work the way that John Winthrop the Younger did. But when instead the reactions went from, they're the devil's Jesuits and the Paris scare, the panic, when the placards went up there about Rosicrucians being in town. And then on the other hand, this sort of orgy of publications defending and detracting them, and people saying, I want to be a member. And the impact was very obviously very disappointing to the people that were behind the idea. And then at the same time, the failure at the Battle of White Mountain of the dreams of a Protestant emperor, and of the realization that, in fact, quite the opposite was about to happen, that there was going to be a major war, and that there would be no support, most likely, from King James, and that the German princes weren't going to come to Frederick's aid as they were supposed to. And the French so deftly played the politics there by reminding everybody, there's no problem with any of you. Frederick's the guy that became King of Bohemia, and he should not have done that. The emperor was king of Bohemia. And so all of a sudden the spirits crash. And you see in Waite's Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, where he says, what happened? What we see that all these pamphlets occur, and then all of a sudden it just trickles off. And the dates, of course, coincide with the Battle of White Mountain and the loss of Frederick's cause. And it took until Frances Yates pretty much to really expose that aspect of it, although she kind of, I think, assumed some things that perhaps weren't there.
Yeah, but that book is so pivotal. Was so pivotal for so many people, even if if it wasn't.
It's an incredible book. And look at the impact on Terence McKenna, and I loved it. I mean, it's a book that I've always loved.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure. It does seem to me that the way you join the Rosicrucians is by looking for them, not finding them, and then doing it yourself. And that's how you become a Rosicrucian. I mean, that was certainly true for so many people in Europe. And it is fascinating for me to draw periods or draw parallels between this period and the 60s, perhaps. It was just such a huge outpouring of creativity. And it always seemed to me that the Rosicrucian manifestos were more of an ideal for people to aim for and self-create in that way, rather than maybe that it was ever even an actual metaphysical order. But I think it was so much more powerful because of that.
I agree. It really begins to become almost a situationist thing.
Yeah.
300 years before situation.
Yeah. Like with Luther Blissett. I've thought about that. So it has occurred to me, though, that kind of like when you talk about this battle, when some of these ideals crested in Europe, that possibly they found their full flowering in America, where it was easier to build off of a blank slate.
I do think that was the idea, because you do see there are pivotal people involved in the effort to bring Frederick into power that shift their attention to America after that. And the interest in America continues, well, I should say in North America, as we see Prince Rupert of the Rhine and his influence in the colonization of Canada. And here is the son of Elizabeth, the Queen of Bohemia, and in a sense, the incarnation of the whole cause of esotericism and the fight against the Catholic Church and his royalist legend in England, and known as this sort of wizard warlock with a magical dog and a magical monkey. And the pamphlets were written. I believe the dog had the honor of being the first animal to ever actually have a pamphlet written about them.
Well, I'm a warlock and I have a magical dog, but I need to get the magical monkey to complete the.
Absolutely, and the nice thing, by the way, is that both sides wrote about the dog. Right, the Catholics made up these stories that it could fly and it was this demon and it would talk, and then the Protestants wrote defensive pamphlets about how great this dog actually was. And at one point, I love this story. Rupert had his battalion. They all got on one knee and they toasted the dog. The dog was super popular in the Royalist army. It was
That's
really
amazing.
Cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, but he's in Canada colonizing there, and then of course Sir Walter Raleigh and in the very earliest colonies in Virginia, bringing Thomas Harriot and others here, with all of them with deep esoteric interests. And I think they were toying with this idea. Francis Bacon kind of crystallized it with New Atlantis, but others, including Andre with Christianopolis, were all trying to conceive of these utopias that might be created in this new world. And so definitely as the canvas is prepared for whatever is going to happen with colonization, and let's not make no mistake, it was an absolute disaster for the indigenous people who had really tremendous cultures going on and would be wiped out, especially in the area that we're talking about in the northeastern America, just decimated by disease, just by the arrival of the colonists.
Yeah, I just heard yesterday that one of the capital cities of the Aztec Empire, just one of them, had more people than the entire Roman Empire in it at its height, which we just never think about. This is incredible. Yeah,
they were huge. The Mississippian civilization was that one of the earliest cities anywhere that was bigger than London or Paris at the time. And so there were flourishing cultures and so many different ones. That's part of the interesting thing about it. I think that the one up in the Northeast is particularly beautiful and was very influential in certain ways. Even though it's controversial, I definitely believe from the research that I've seen that the Iroquois concept of democracy was an influence. And there was more to it than just Ben Franklin's caustic remark that if savages, quote unquote, could create and make a democracy work, then why couldn't the colonies? But there were discussions about how this democracy worked for them. And so when you bring everybody's coming into America, and you have these outliers like I write about Thomas Morton, the pagan pilgrim, who was a royalist who was sent to the colonies at the age of 50 and who opened up a trading post that was as different from Pilgrim America as it could possibly be. This was a person that modeled himself after Shakespeare's Falstaff and was a typical cavalier bon vivant, loving drink and music and women and philosophy and deeply read in myths of ancient cultures. And when he dealt with the indigenous people, he was interested in their religions and in their dreams and in helping them. And he first attracted the ire of the pilgrims because he was selling guns. He was not supposed to be, to the local tribes. He said so that they could protect themselves from the predatory tribes that were coming in and taking their land because of the losses that were being suffered due to disease. But the pilgrims saw this as a threat to their colony because they didn't get along well with the indigenous people. The indigenous people trusted Tom Morton. And then there's this famous incident on May Day where he erected a maypole. They found this huge yellow pine and they stripped it down until it was just glowing and put ribbons on it and put it on a green hill that was right over the Atlantic. And they invited everyone, pirates, traders, indigenous people, the pilgrims. Everybody was invited to this party. Of course, the pilgrims did not attend. And in fact, he's the first American to receive a visit from the authorities because of a wild party.
That's a great honor.
Yeah, isn't it? And he also wrote he's the first American to ever publish a fart joke.
So a true American then.
He did a lot of little puns and stuff at the pilgrims. He had nicknames for them, and he really reveals a side of them that is very different from the Disney-fied side of the pilgrims that America was brainwashed with for so long.
Okay.
And so here he is celebrating May Day and in a place called Marymount. And he knows all the puns that are associated. Not only does it mean the Mountain of Mary, it's also a Latin pun on the male genitalia, and it's also Mary Mount, as in having a good time, and that way. And so they have these big party, and everything goes great, and he's feeling that this is what America should be. Everybody's invited. Everybody participates. There's no need for a wall. The pilgrims live behind walls, but Marymount has no walls. But the pilgrims decide that he is too dangerous, and they start to go after him in various ways, legally back in London, legally there. And they attack him, literally. They arrest him. They destroyed Marymount eventually. Everyone who worked for him had to wind up working for the pilgrims and taking up their kind of Christianity. And he was tortured by them. They starved him. They sent him to live on an island with hardly any provisions at all, hoping that he would just die. But the local indigenous people brought him things. And then it's a complicated story I tell about how for a while he prevailed because the royalists were back in power. And then once again, a new king arrived and the rules changed again. And he failed to even influence America, and in many ways is completely forgotten. But to me, he's like a founding father that represents an alternative America, that, again, the shadow side of America, the esoteric side, that maybe is what everyone is in love with about America, but America doesn't act that way or do things according to those ideas, because America is kind of locked into this idea that it's something different than what it actually was and is.
Right. I want to, now that you brought up the Puritans, I want to touch on that, because we so often hear that America is a Puritan country at its heart, that it has been defined by the Protestant work ethic, the Pilgrims, sexual repression, sexual Puritanism. And I wonder if that's actually true. I'm curious how you see that, because that seems just really an oversimplification. There's so much in this country.
I definitely think that it is an oversimplification. It's not only an oversimplification, but it's a means of in a sense, channeling spiritual history into a way that is more functional for the purposes of people who support certain perspectives. And so to this day, we have people who are get very violently angry at the idea that this is not a Christian country, that they don't like the idea that it isn't right now ruled according to Christian law by strict Christians. And when you look at the actual history, what you find is very different than that. To begin with, in the colonies, I can't remember the exact number right off the top of my head, but it might have been, I think it might have been 30% was church attendance in those days. There was constant
a lot lower than you might think.
Yes, and many complaints by ministers and priests talking about we can't get these damn Americans into the pews.
I mean, to be fair, if you came to the U.S. and you're surrounded by all this unbelievable wilderness, and that's both incredibly beautiful and incredibly harsh. I mean, I don't know if
frightening
and I mean, there's a whole lot to do other than sit in a church pew.
Yes, absolutely. And also you're running into all these other belief systems that are bumping into each other, and you're learning other approaches.
So let's talk about
people.
that. Absolutely. So you mentioned Indigenous, and I want to, let's talk about that, the Indigenous influence, both that, the settlers came into contact with, but also in general. And then I want to touch on the African influence, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with just an interesting example of Indigenous influence and how it gets distorted. So I'll give you two. First, Thomas Harriot, who was arguably the first scientist working in America, was brought here with the Virginia colony, and who wrote a chilling book, an amazing book, but a book in which he detailed everything that was available in America for exploitation, and use this phrase, we took it and we ate it, about almost any kind of animal that you can imagine.
Okay.
And
all right.
Yeah, it was really, so you're really seeing in that book, you're seeing this business plan for what the future of America will be. It's the pure heart of capitalist, industrialized,
just eating everything.
Thinking.
Yeah, I'm just as you're saying this, I'm just like flashing on like Costco, people in line for free food samples at Costco.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, but it is. It's like aisles of these descriptions of future products, okay, and divided into their various themes, and each aisle having its own. And so in one way, he represents something really terrible. But at the same time, while he was here, when he engaged with the indigenous people, he was very interested in language, in religion, in how they viewed their dreams, and all the details of their lives. And so in trying to capture languages that did not fit into the letters that we all know, he invented an alphabet. And then he decided maybe this alphabet could be modified in such a way that it could be an alphabet that could capture the sounds of every language, so that you could write every language on Earth using this alphabet. It's an amazing idea, and it absolutely,
it's a very hermetic idea.
Yes, isn't it? And it has all that sense of the willingness and the exuberance to change the world and discover the truth, and that we also saw in the 60s again with that resemblance, this hyper creativity and optimism about changing the world. And so Harriot takes this alphabet back to London with him, and Raleigh gets into trouble because of his plot against King James, but they're still somewhat protected by the wizard Earl Henry, who is a good friend of James. And as we know, Raleigh sets himself up in the Tower of London, living rather the good life. And then eventually the wizard Earl follows him there, but he's got a bowling alley built. And at first it's looking pretty good. And they're having all their laboratory experiments and intellectual discussions and writing books. And then things go south. There are accusations of one of the things that they said, for example, was that Raleigh had been overheard saying at a dinner that Thomas Harriot could make better miracles than Jesus or Moses. There was an accusation that Bible pages were used to wrap tobacco. And these were really serious charges at the time. And Harriot became notorious as this Satanist. And the alphabet became known as the devil's alphabet. And it would reappear here and there again in sort of shoddy potboiler exploitation magical works or satanic works as the devil's alphabet, as an alphabet that was given by demons for use specifically in this way, and in fact was invented to capture an indigenous American language. And I think that story shows how warped. You see again this split personality that will wind up being a big feature in America in the future, where on the one hand we have the interest in another religion, another culture, and the desire to capture it. And then we have this willingness to demonize and to exploit going hand in hand and sometimes attacking each other. And so that's one example on the indigenous side. Now, on the other side, we have people coming over, the cunning folk. They're how do they differ from those who are called witches? Well, most of those who are called witches in America who suffer persecution don't really have the skills of cunning folk. They tend to be women who, because of their economic position and because of their outsider status in their local society and often their lack of socialization for one reason or another, are easily demonized. The cunning women and men are people who do have these skills. They can find things through dreams or dowsing or with a horoscope. They know herbal remedies or little superstitions that supposedly cure things. And if they're good at it, they are safe and they're popular and they're never accused of being witches. Now, these people, they are interacting with indigenous people who are involved in this new society, and also with the African slaves who were brought over and with the traditions that they brought from Africa. And unlike the Christians, who in the strictest of them are afraid of these other traditions and think of them as strictly demonic, so you don't want to know anything about it. So, for example, you get early writers saying, yeah, these shamans could do stuff. No doubt. We saw them do things that are impossible, like producing snow on a hot summer day in a goblet or all sorts of things. And they say, but that's clearly the power of the devil. And so but the cunning folk aren't thinking that way. The cunning folk are saying, well, how do you cure this? And how do you fix this kind of a problem? And they're all comparing notes as they begin to see that basically they are fulfilling the same functions for their cultures, right? So it's an exciting time to be able to access another culture's information. And it's not just cunning folk doing this. There are also those in the Hermetic tradition who approach it in a similar way because they are educated about the ancient world. They know that Plotinus followed after the armies of imperial Rome in order to hopefully be able to speak to the wise men of Arabia and of India. And they want to speak to other cultures. They want to find out if they see similarities. And often they see similarities maybe that weren't there. So, for example, Thomas Morton thought that the indigenous people might be the missing tribe of Israel because they had Hebrew kind of sounding words in some of the language. So, and then other things happened that brought to people's attention how the natives live, so that you have some thinkers like Morton and Harriot saying, I don't know, I mean, are we actually the superior culture? Because these people live, they're healthier than we are, they're happier than we are, their families function better than ours. They don't have to hide behind walls. They live in harmony with nature. The vegetables they grow are better than the vegetables that we grow.
Yeah, it's always struck me that kind of shock of contact also filtered back to Europe, and I would suspect was through, for instance, writings of various philosophers. I mean, that was responsible in some ways for the sea change in thinking that occurred in Europe like writers like Rousseau and things like that, and the Enlightenment and the revolutions that swept through Europe. I think perhaps just coming in contact with that, seeing a different way, and then becoming enamored with this idea of the quote unquote noble savage, which of course is also not seeing the reality at all.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so. I think that there you get, for instance, you remember back in the day, they used to have these, it's incredible, like in the suburban homes in the 50s, they loved indigenous sculpture. Like here is a Sioux warrior with his bonnet on a dying horse, and this would be like on the fireplace.
Yes.
It's such a strange thing to have this culture that decimated the other culture wind up fetishizing images of it.
Well, that's and now we have, like people wearing Indian headdresses at festivals at Coachella and things like this, but I do remember that now that you're talking about that, just my grandparents having that. I mean, Westerns were so huge as well, which was probably a part of it. But yeah, it has always struck me as slightly sinister that the 60s countercultures were, came on the wake of America's nuclear domination of the planet, and the way that Americans celebrated winning the global battle was dressing up like the people they had genocided in the previous centuries.
This is true. Although one can say that there was, to a certain degree, an attempt to embrace what was considered to be the belief system or the practices of the culture. It was in dressing that way. Many of the hippies, for example, were rejecting the culture that had produced the bomb, and were saying that they wanted to go and live like the indigenous people had. But then at the same time, so much exploitation. I mean, first there's a whole question of appropriation at that point. And then there's the whole problem of people declaring themselves teachers who don't have the bloodline or the learning. And then these sort of false. So I think a great example of this is Castaneda.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a new incredible biography of him coming out called American Trickster that is going to be just a blockbuster.
Great.
I think it will be out this year.
Great.
Maybe in March.
I spoke to one of his a long time ago. I spoke to one of his witches, as he called them.
Interesting.
She was not a believer in his bullshit. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think, well, what I understand from reading interviews with the author of this book is that this book will really firmly place him as a cult leader and will show a very disturbing side of him. But on the other hand, let's look at what he achieved. So we get this alleged anthropological report written that UCLA gets behind about Don Juan, and then it happens to hit America right at the time when kids are getting into exploring drugs for spiritual purposes. And so it's really speaking to that generation, and it sells at an incredible rate. And UCLA has never made that kind of money on a book. And so they're pushing that book, and he becomes a star. And he's a recluse. We're not even sure we have a picture of him. They say that the Time magazine cover was probably an imposter. And he buys this building, and he creates this sort of like community with his witches. And we're not even sure. I guess we'll find out now what was going on in there. But at the time, everybody thought this was a field anthropologist who'd met Don Juan out there, and that he was reporting Yaqui beliefs. And as time goes on and academia catches up with all this, we discover, first of all, well, those actually aren't Yaqui beliefs, because now that we've actually gone and worked our anthropology with the Yaquis, we know what their beliefs are. And then the search for Don Juan, well, of course, we never find him. He fits beautifully into the invisible master tradition. The fault of not finding him is no doubt upon us because we are unworthy. But then you start to hear things about how he remarketed, like people don't realize that he took a lot of his older teachings and he remarketed them as tensegrity and this kind of Buckminster Fuller conceptualization. He was teaching the same basic things, but in this new kind of computer world friendly, technical, intellectual approach. And it didn't sell that well. So then they went back and he did another Don Juan kind of retrospective. And can we deny that he was a huge and important influence on so many people? The truth was found in the books in some level that changed people's lives, and that people who were just beginning, I mean, the work that will eventually become Terence McKenna's, he in a sense begins by the whole ayahuasca thing, in a sense, starts with him.
Yeah. I think it strikes me, it's another situation similar to the Rosicrucian manifestos, where the myth is a lot more important than the actual truth. But
Yes.
I'm remembering now, the woman I spoke to was Amy Wallace, who's now passed on, unfortunately. She was the daughter of Irving Wallace, who wrote that very famous book in the 70s, The Intimate Sex Lives of Famous People, which I ended up becoming a ghostwriter on, and I wrote like 10 new chapters for the new version, and one of them was on Castaneda, so I ended up speaking with her, and her take on what had happened, she suspected that Don Juan was real, that Castaneda had met him as a grad student, a UCLA grad student, and had gone down there, and had, that first book was, to all intents and purposes, accurate, but then he went back down. Once he started making a ton of money, then he went back down to get more for more books. And whoever Don Juan was like, hey, man, like, where's my half? And Castaneda's like, what are you talking about, your half? I'm just doing field work here. And then he was cut off. It's like, no, I'm not. You're not going to rip me off like this. And then, so from the second book on, I think her take was he just started making it up, and he was making a lot of money. So
I think that sounds, I mean, certainly logical.
Yeah, and some of those later books are just out to lunch. I want to talk, before we lose the thread, I want to talk about the African diaspora and the influence on American spirituality there, because that does not get talked about enough, and it's huge. I mean, we're talking about the creation of whole new religions in the Afro-Caribbean tradition and that type of thing.
Yes. Oh, and far beyond. I mean, it's when you consider, let's just look at that for a moment, and let's look at New Orleans and the influence there of that Caribbean African culture, and how it turns into American music, the distinctly American forms of music, as rhythm and blues, jazz, and rock and roll are all born from rituals
Robert Johnson.
in Congo Square. And the rituals begin simply as people gathering to play the drums and dance. They're not allowed to do their full African rituals, but they can do that. And the local white population used to gather to ogle at this spectacle of everyone dancing wildly. And apparently there were stories of ladies who fainted when they heard the drums, and they just couldn't, it was just the most devilish, outlandish sound they'd ever heard. And this, of course, becomes what is recognized now as an American art form. And that American art form has a spiritual side to it. So it leads directly to something like Coltrane's A Love Supreme. It leads to, even though they're not American, you could say it leads to the Beatles, right?
Absolutely.
With their whole love song books of love. And on and on. I mean, it's just so many. I don't want to belabor the point. And so this is just one small example of how big the influence is. And then in the esoteric world, I want to add, while we're on this subject, there you also have these strange examples. Like there were Kabbalists who wandered into the colonies, from people who had traveled all over the world and who wanted to visit the colonies as well, and who brought Kabbalah here. And there was a very early university president at Yale who made the serious argument that Kabbalah should be taught at all American schools.
Can you imagine?
Right? I know. And so you could actually find someone like that, and if the fate brought you in their presence and you have the interest, they would teach you. And so there were all these different cultures. But going back now to the indigenous and the African, which were profoundly influential, and I think they dovetailed in many ways. And so I think that an interesting person to consider in this respect is Randolph, who is a multi-race person whose racial identity, at times he tries to deny it and sometimes he's embracing it. Sometimes he's using it to his advantage. Sometimes he's complaining that it's prevented him from receiving the respect that he deserved. And this really shows us the predicament. I mean, it's hard enough to be an esoteric in a predominantly Christian political culture, but to be one of color and to be so brilliant and so ahead of his time. I always think of Randolph as somebody that if you had dropped Randolph into Haight-Ashbury, he would have been a star. Mm-hmm. But he was so too early. And all these things that he gave birth to with that imagination, the influence on the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the influence on Theosophy through Blavatsky's competitive and hostile feelings around him, and the way that he brought together the idea of ritual practice for gains, material gains, almost defines a whole area of American spiritual preoccupation, from mind cure to practicing manifestation.
Well, he was also profoundly influential on Crowley and Thelema and the hard occult end of things.
Absolutely.
He's, and the whole idea of sex magic, in a sense, kind of goes back to him, if I'm correct.
Yes, and he's an abolitionist. He's fighting for the rights of women. He's talking about birth control at a time when that was a dangerous subject, and so he's really a remarkable American. And I do think that he sort of gives birth to a whole stream of, well, he definitely does, of Rosicrucianism, right? Because there still is the Rosicrucian organization that claims heritage from him, and so he's a giant, I think, in American metaphysical religion. And fortunately, we have some wonderful studies of him now, like Patrick Devaney's. And he's somebody that I wish more Americans knew about, and exemplifies a way that, because he's able to reach back into African tradition. So when I hear about, there was a time apparently where he organized these sort of course, they were accused of just being wild parties, but they were meant to be specific ritually oriented experiences where he would bring together hashish, men of color, and well-heeled white women. And this, of course, created a big scandal. But this is this community getting together as a community, and the use of the intoxicating sacrament and including sexuality in the proceedings, to me, seemed to be a way of deconstructing the European westernized version of spiritual pursuit. It's similar to what was going on in the circles that Rasputin was moving around in Russia at the turn of the 20th century. And it's shedding a lot of this morality of the West and embracing this much more direct approach, and to maybe even pushing it further than its origins were used to practicing.
Have you ever read the book Flight to Canada by Ishmael Reed?
I have not.
I highly recommend that. It's a novel, but it talks about American history as if it's a kind of tapestry of two competing conspiracies. And the two conspiracies are African rhythms, which are referred to as just grew in the book, and, stuffy European classical music and stick up the ass type behavior. And that the whole history of America can be explained as this vast esoteric conspiracy between these two forms of music. And it's like worthy of Illuminatus trilogy, or better in some ways.
That sounds great. I'll definitely recommend check it out. Yeah. I think that's very true. I think that this is the split that we're talking about here.
Okay.
It's the esoteric side where exploration is encouraged, where women and people of color are held up, and where there is fascination and curiosity about other cultures and their belief systems, and a willingness to share, and a distrust of hierarchy and autocracy, and a restlessness that keeps moving at first westward to get away from those from the other side of it. And the other side of it is this corporate, hierarchical, authoritarian, everybody has to believe the same thing, there is only one right way approach. And America is so much both of these, but we have been mostly the latter, because the latter has seized the narrative. And so many of the people who represent the former, the esoteric side, have been left out of historical narrative and are pretty much forgotten. That was one of the big motivations for me in writing the book. I felt like, I didn't intend to write this book. This was something that I did. It started way back when I worked for Manly Hall, and I was just trying to get answers to questions. Finding something like The Platonist, this newspaper wrapped up in a leather-bound tome that was published around the time of the gunfight at OK Corral, on what was then the frontier. I couldn't understand it, and Mr. Hall didn't know much about it, and so those kinds of mysteries led me to research and talk to academics and on for a long time. And when I would tour with my band, I would go to libraries and to bookstores looking for more information about these various mysteries. And eventually, I realized that this was a book, and I felt like I was rescuing these people from the lake of forgetfulness, and that I found them so invigorating. People ask me, well, there's so many frauds in there, and it makes them feel cynical. And I try to tell them, actually, what the book convinced me, that you can find a lot of wisdom in the hands of frauds. And that a lot of people who are known for their wisdom had a little bit of fraud too.
Yeah, that's one of life's consistent paradoxes, I think. It's interesting, though, as you're talking about this, as you have been talking about this, I've been thinking that so many of the cultural forms that have started in America have been and are still considered, trash. So, for instance, rock and roll, comic books, science fiction, these are all considered, or by the broader establishment, or by certainly by European artists, to be completely beneath contempt. And yet and jazz is another. Well, jazz is not considered beneath contempt, but it was for a while. And it strikes me that that is obviously not the case. These are profoundly creative, unique, important cultural movements. And I'm wondering if esotericism, perhaps American esotericism. I've been saying this word for 30 years. You think I could get it? Could be seen in that light as this kind of underdog tradition that is so worthy of exploration.
Oh, I think so. Definitely. I think that it's, although we have American homegrown varieties of repressive Christianity in a big way, a lot of the evangelical developments and such, but in a sense, between the Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations that originated in Europe, a big chunk of American Christianity is involved in European institutions.
I hadn't considered that before.
And so the whole thought process in those institutions and in the way they're organized and what they teach is going to be, it's this, we call it elitist, perhaps. Maybe that's not the right word, but it's our way is the only true way. And so anything that differs from our way is demonic, or if you have grown out of demonic, it's trash. The influence of American, of these trashed arts and beliefs, though, are enormous, and in the real meaning of the word, monstrous, and both in that they're vast and that they do have a warping effect. So I, for example, argue in the book that I think that you could make a pretty good argument that American Christianity resembles American metaphysical Christianity. I'm sorry, I just did it too. American Christianity resembles American metaphysical religion more than it does traditional Christianity.
That's interesting, and I think certainly a lot of the Christian groups that came over here initially were cults. I mean, it's like you read about these things that seem like mainstream denominations now, like Presbyterians and Methodists, and like at the time they were practically like snake handlers, like out in the boonies in the UK, and so Chris Hedges, the writer, I'm sure always says American Christianity or evangelical Christianity is not Christianity. It's heresy. He considers it heresy. But
well, Harold
in a way-
Bloom.
Mhm.
Harold Bloom used to call it American Gnosticism, and he also called it American Orphism. He felt that it resembled Persian religion more than Christianity.
You mean in the black and white good versus evil obsession?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Say more about that.
Well, he's a fascinating character. He's another really bedrock figure in the study of American metaphysical religion. He wrote a book, I think it was called The American Religion. I can't believe I can't remember it right now, but I think that's what it was called. And it was this masterpiece. And he was looking at American religion and saying, wow, this isn't Christianity. Here's a literary critic looking at religion and noticing that the title and the narrative have nothing to do with each other. And so he in his study of it, he came to the conclusion that whether you were looking at somebody like Jim Morrison or you were looking at American evangelical Pentecostalism, that it resembled the Persian concept of spirituality more than it did the European. And in the sense that you have already said, in the battle between dark and light, in the heroic stance, and the fire worship aspect of it, and in the desire to, in a sense, identifying the approval of divinity with having success and prosperity.
Well, that's a very Calvinist inheritance, I would say.
As well, certainly.
Yeah. So did he have kind of a general take on why that was? Or an overarching theory about it?
He thinks that it was, I mean, what's the best? This is such this could be a podcast unto itself, that book. But basically what he's seeing is that as the melting pot is bubbling along, and as the people are not particularly well educated, but they have more freedom and access to individuality by moving west and reinventing themselves, that they fall out of the pessimistic viewpoint of most Christianity, the fatalism of it, and they are attracted to modified versions that give them a sense of fighting against something, but also of heroic effort.
Interesting. There's obviously great things about that, and also profoundly problematic things about it, as we saw, for instance, in the Satanic Panic. And I see you even touched upon QAnon in this book, where it just gets completely out of hand. But that's really interesting. I had never considered that before. It also makes me think, for as cringe as this comment is going to be, Star Wars, in a sense, I think really brings so many of these things together and became kind of like an American folk religion in its own right, oddly enough.
Yes, I think so. And I think that when you consider that in all religions, the words that are used to define the information that has to be shared are subject to context, as Wittgenstein pointed out so long ago, and are easily abstracted into things that may not actually exist. I always loved his example of time as the second hand on your watch, and then this abstract concept of time. And his idea was, well, there is no abstract time. There's the time. The time is what happens when the sun does this and the earth does that, and we notice it, and the second hand keeps it. That's time. And so he was always fighting against that human tendency to sort of make Platonic forms out of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that something like Star Wars and a phrase like the Force can convey the same thing that's being conveyed in esoteric language and through simple language and visuals and emotional reactions. And this again would, I think, speak to Bloom's idea of the Persian mysticism or the American Gnosticism, that there is this sense that it must appeal to people who are going to be sitting out there in the movie theater, that we're not dealing with a domesticated church, brought up in churches with deep education and with a deep understanding of the Bible. We're dealing with a populace that is restless, that wants to be distracted, wants to see miracles all the time, and doesn't much care if they're CGI or not.
That's a great point. That's interesting. And I was thinking also, you brought up Jim Morrison and so many of these things. There really does seem to be an element of, faith revivalism to so many spiritual things in America. And I was just thinking, you were talking about, people are not necessarily approaching these things academically. They are perhaps uneducated. But I'm thinking, from Jim Morrison to snake handling to, tent revivals to Tony Robbins events, things like this. I mean, there always does seem to be that tremendously physical aspect to how people approach things here. And I wonder why that is.
I think part of it probably is because we're such a young country, with our frontier having so recently really been conquered. Most of the European countries have such old and rich histories, and here the pioneer spirit is something that's still somewhat fresh. And in the 1960s, the kids were still feeling it. They used to bring ponies around the suburbs and with cowboy outfits and stuff, and your kid can take a picture. And there was definitely a Western fetish, even in the far West, like Los Angeles and San Francisco. They were fetishizing Western culture, pioneer culture, indigenous culture. And I think that you can see, a really good example of this, I think, and I think that you're the right person to talk about this with, and that opportunity may not come up again in a podcast anytime soon, is Genesis.
Oh, yes.
Because here is an example.
Genesis Peerage, not the band that Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel
exactly.
Okay, got to specify.
Exactly. So here's Genesis, who we're taking this art form that's born in Congo Square, and now we're reapplying it into something similar to its original intent, right? With psychic TV, we're making ritual out of every song. Where the drum is a ritual instrument again with Genesis, and then this circle goes all the way to the way that Genesis. The friend of mine actually produced the documentary Blight of the Twin.
Yes,
which showed.
Wait, which person?
Tiffany Naiman.
Okay, no, I don't know her. All right, I know Douglas and Hazel, but
Hazel is a friend of Tiffany's.
I see. Okay.
Tiffany's a wonderful producer, but she's also a professor in music at Stanford and at UCLA.
Wow, very cool.
So the music that Genesis recognizes the original intent of and then revitalizes it with psychic TV, and then eventually returns to the culture of origin of that music and participates in ritual in order to be bound, so that to become a they with the beloved. And so I think that's an incredible example of the influence of African culture through America.
Yeah, it's profound, and it can't be emphasized enough, I think, but also created so many new cultural forms here.
Yes.
And that's fascinating. I want to bring this up to the 20th century, but before that, I want to make sure we touch on some of the late 1800s, the spiritualism, I think that even blending into kind of Edgar Cayce. And I definitely want to talk about people whiling out on Mount Shasta. That's going to be fun. But kind of if you want to go to the kind of turn of the century there, because that definitely seems to be when things crystallize into quote unquote esotericism as we now understand it.
Well, to me, it kind of begins with transcendentalism.
Oh yes, let's touch on that for sure.
So here's this explosion with Emerson, and we really get to see the impact and how controversial Emerson was when we look at people like Hiram Jones or Thomas Johnson, who will become part of the Platonist movement that occurs next. and who describe being young men, either in school or at their university, and finding Emerson's book, which at that time was being universally critiqued as basically insane and a betrayal of everything that America and Christianity stand for, and read it and had their lives completely changed. And then in most cases, they wanted to read what Emerson had read, and that threw them back to the Neoplatonists. And through there, opened up the doors to Hermeticism and the whole Western tradition. And so Transcendentalism becomes this moment, this watershed moment, when it all kind of surges into public awareness and reaches popularity again after bubbling under the surface for so long in the wake of the Great Awakening, when Christianity, and especially very strict Christianity, became this very popular religion again. And so the Transcendentalists give birth to this kind of, it's almost at the same time, but a little bit later, this whole Platonist movement occurs. Hiram K. Jones is they call him the Plato of the West, and he has some great nicknames. And he loved to talk about Plato, and he would go to the Transcendentalist events, and he would give these 4 or 5 hour speeches about Plato and Plato's beliefs, and people would listen, and then they would go out and take a boat ride on the Concord, and then they would come back and listen some more. And there were clubs that opened up in the frontier, in the Midwest, usually run by women, by teachers, and sometimes by men who were involved in schools. And they were bringing in speakers who were, like Hiram K. Jones, experts on Platonism, and they were studying Plato and celebrating Plato's birthday. And I actually include in the book a description of one of these Plato birthday rituals that these women were having. And so Plato became inexplicably popular. The newspapers and the magazines were all carrying stories about Plato. And it was all the rage to such a degree that academics are arguing that there's nothing that happens later in American spirituality, esotericism, that isn't marked by Plato because of the saturation point that occurred there. And so the next thing is spiritualism seems to be somewhat inspired by Platonism.
God, I'd never heard before. That's fascinating.
And so what happens is, for example, spiritualism, well, let's go back to Platonism for a moment and say, why would a woman get into this stuff? Why wasn't she just studying the Bible or doing what women were supposed to be doing according to the church? Well, for one thing, Plato was very elite. And among men, to understand and discuss Plato was considered to mean that you were really something. And so women who could do this, there were women who could read Plato in Greek. They were claiming power. They were showing off that they had intellects that were equal to that of the best of the males around them. And this was a form of very early women's liberation in these parties. And so spiritualism, as usual, occurring in the rural area, it goes way back in America, back to the Shakers, back to the Quakers. There were sleeping prophets, and the Shakers had young women who heard angelic music and then fell into trance, and the dead would speak through them. And it's a long tradition in America to want to speak to the dead. And so, but then with the Fox sisters, for whatever reason, suddenly it hit the public imagination. Maybe the media had grown up enough in terms of the distribution networks of newspapers and such that more people could hear about it more quickly. And that created a kind of reaction that we would later see with things like Elvis. And everybody wanted to do their own experiments or to hear these mediums. And as a result of this, women who were channeling male spirits for the most part would be able to command auditoriums filled with men and tell them that they were wrong about this or that they should be doing that.
Okay.
Women who would not even be allowed to say anything in front of a group of men. It became quite powerful. If you look at someone like Victoria Woodhull, who became the first female stockbroker on Wall Street and the first female presidential candidate, and was for a while a leading suffragette until her psychic stuff became too much of a scandal for everyone. And she really made herself a powerful woman of the time and did it all through her abilities as a medium, but also because she was no fool. She educated herself. And so who was her spirit control? Who was the spirit she claimed who inspired her to give the first speech that a woman ever gave before Congress? Unless it was Frances Wright who did that. But it was a very early one, if not the first. Well, it was Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator.
Interesting.
So that now you're claiming power through, well, Demosthenes speaks through me, and I'm going to now lay down
this was
what's
before
wrong with your
Congress.
ideas.
This is before Congress?
She did not tell Congress that Demosthenes was there, but she did later say so in print.
Okay.
That that's who inspired her. And so she was meanwhile fighting for birth control. She wanted women to be able to divorce. She thought that marriages should be handled very differently than they were. And she believed in the importance of female sexuality in the same way that Randolph did, without any of the other ritual aspects of it. And she is a good example, I think, of applying these spiritual principles in ways that lead to political movements and to political influence. Then as we go up further, well, first of all, we have this popularity of spiritualism is a cesspool of exploitation, of course. And you have examples like the Witch of Lime Street, who was notorious for being almost naked or wearing these very see-through kinds of gowns. And for many of these mediums were basically peep shows or disguised prostitution.
Okay. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, and there was also organized crime. So they were these groups of mediums who would tip each other off about good clients and give them information about them and all that. And all kinds of seedy themes.
Well, that continues today. I mean, in terms of the psychic mafia of kind of like street corner psychic shops, that
right,
definitely organized crime.
Yes,
low level.
And then you also have you have seedy little scenes like Houdini trying to prove that the Witch of Lime Street is a fraud, and he actually commits an act of fraud to try to trick her into an act of fraud. And there's a description in my book about this one sequence where the only way that he can make sure she's not fraudulent is he's got her tied up on a chair in a box, and he's got his bare thigh against her inner bare thigh so he can feel her move. I mean, it's really kinky stuff.
Okay.
And so a lot of this is boiling under the surface with spiritualism, and it becomes scandalous. So many frauds are exposed. There's so many mistakes making and fraudulent things said. And of course, that's the case in any profession. I always remind people, whether it's doctors or lawyers or anything else, there's going to be a tiny percentage of brilliant, selfless people, and then very expensive, technically skilled people, and then a lot of people who don't know what they're doing but claim they do.
Well, I think there's a meta point to be made there that struck me, where you're talking about the Houdini and his kind of like trying to get some type of sexual fulfillment, or whether it's the will to power has to be expressed through spiritualism, where there's kind of something that spiritualism or occultism is a cover for another need. But once it's put into a different ritual context, it's like, now it's okay. I'm thinking also of like Anton LaVey's orgies and things like that. I don't think people were, like everyone who saw that was excited about it, but was not thinking about, the deep metaphysical meaning of it. It was like, this is like I don't want to say an excuse, but but that's always seems to be the case with spiritualism and occultism. The people who are interested in it are also invariably pushing against the walls of restriction and are interested in things like alternative relationship styles or drugs, or at this period in history, women's liberation. So that I think shouldn't be underestimated in the sense of like, it's really important to distinguish what the covert goals are going on, what covert goals are happening with people who are involved in this. There might be talking about, ascended masters and the quest for truth and all of this, but really they're there for other reasons. And it's not necessarily a sinister thing. It's just, it needs to be picked apart if you're interested in the actual intellectual content of some of these movements.
Agreed. I definitely think that the pressure to make a living is very underestimated in terms of what kinds of distortions it causes in the arcs of teachers.
Well, that's something that I feel that American spiritual movements have really had to come to grips with as well, because, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, like, I think about like the time I spent in England, you know, most of the people that are real heavily involved in the occult there are, you know, on the dole, or, you know, they're just like upper crust and they have money. So there's not this sense of needing to constantly be a success and do the Horatio Alger thing. And I feel that people should not be hung up about sometimes the financial aspects of these things, because it is a skill that people have that other people want. And so I don't know, but I feel that American spirituality has really had to tackle that head on, and it's been successful in some ways.
I think we have a heritage here too of distrusting the wealthy that goes back to the origination of the country, where they were basically the elite was throwing people out of the country and saying, we don't want you here.
Right.
Now, to continue our talk about spiritualism and how does it evolve? So when we reach Edgar Cayce, we see something that is a different approach in a way. Now we have, in the past, we had spiritual communities where a bunch of mediums, and we still have them, like Lilydale, would have houses, or there might be spiritual camps where you go in summer and spend a weekend and listen to various mediums and speakers. And Cayce comes along. First of all, it's very interesting to see him too, the way he's influenced by theosophy. So, for example, as the work of K. Paul Johnson has shown, that he doesn't talk about reincarnation until he goes south and he takes some classes at a Theosophical Society meeting, and he learns about it. And now, is this that he has now decided that makes sense to me, so I'm going to include it in the readings, or is it, as some argue, that he was unable as a Christian who distrusted these things to talk about reincarnation? So when whatever was guiding him in his channeling went to speak about it, it would be blocked. But now that Theosophy opened that door, suddenly there could be readings about reincarnation. But in him, we do see how his readings are influenced by this melting pot of beliefs, and they grow and become more inclusive and diverse as a result over time. And he really is, although there were others such as the mind cure healer Quimby, or very much so Andrew Jackson Davis, one of the great early American mediums, very popular. They had communities around them. They had volunteers and people working with them and such. But Edgar Cayce actually creates an organization in ARE, or an organization is created around him and around these readings that becomes a huge influence on American metaphysics going forward, especially on the New Age. And so many of his ideas became commonplace in the New Age, but at the time were radical. And some of them are things that, again, as Johnson has pointed out, that we see now as common sense in holistic medicine, but they appear first in the Cayce readings. So we're getting a different focus here. It's much less razzle dazzle and talk to a dead relative, and it's now turning into, why am I this way? Like, how come I am not successful? And the answer isn't that you're being crossed by a malevolent spirit or something like that. It's karma related to a past life, or it's some kind of for instance, he often would talk about how even things like problems with the spine would be related to emotional tunings, that a person who's afraid all the time.
Yeah, that makes me think of, what's that one? Louise Hay?
Yes.
What was it? There was like she wrote that book where like every single physical problem can be traced to, like, you know, you have issues with your mother, that type of thing.
The meaning of a certain emotional distortion or disharmony that creates this problem. Yeah, exactly. And that's what he was doing. That's Quimby. That really goes back to Quimby more than anything, I think. But the guy, Quimby was somebody who very strongly influenced Mary Baker Eddy. It was one of his patients, and basically took his system of belief and practice and made it into Christian Science. And Quimby was this. That's a long discussion. Let's stick to where we are and talk about. So now we have Cayce. Now he becomes very famous, and a big influence in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And then we'd get these sort of TV psychics and these famous characters who pop up on Dr. Phil or things like that. But we haven't really seen spectacular cases of psychics so much. But I would argue that we have actually seen two, one who was famous at one time and one who never was famous at all. And the one who was famous was a woman named Betty White, of course, not that Betty White. And she, with her husband, Stuart Edward White, wrote a series of books, the most famous of which was called The Unobstructed Universe. And this was a completely different kind of activity. It started with a Ouija board. It went into automatic writing and then into channeling. But rather than it having anything to do with let's talk to our dead relatives or let's even get healing prescriptions, this was about teaching Betty how to cross over and come back while she was still here and to describe what the other side is. And her description of it is radically different. She talks about how we exist in an obstructed dimension of the same world that they exist in an unobstructed way. And she goes into great deal about how detail about how frequencies work and all kinds of fascinating perceptions on how life functions and then it eventually gets around to having a good life. So to give you an example, she talks about the experience of falling into what she calls the vortex. And when you fall into the vortex, you have forgotten that you are a soul, that you will survive your body. And now you are living afraid inside your body, filled with angst.
Was she talking about Orange County?
Yes. And probably doing stupid things. And so there's a sense that and now here's the amazing thing about this story, by the way. So these books, Stuart had already been a very successful writer of sort of adventure novels, and he was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. Roosevelt said that he was the best shot that he'd ever seen. He had a golden trout named after him in California in a sequoia grove. And he was a remarkable human being. They were very successful even during the Depression. They lived this like amazing, perfect life with a yacht going to Alaska all the time and just lovely. Really two people deeply in love and making something of their lives.
They should have, if only they'd had Instagram.
Right? And they never did a school. They never encouraged followers. In fact, most of their work was anonymous. And then Betty, the spirits at a certain, they call them the invisibles, at a certain point told them, okay, this part of it's done. And now we're going to have to do something else that they call the blossoming. And they said, it may not be comfortable, but this is the only way to finish the work. And Stuart thought, well, this is just going to be more a deeper level of teaching of some kind. But then 2 weeks later, Betty became extremely ill. And for 2 months, she suffered while Stuart tried to convince her that healing herself was what the spirits were after. They wanted her to prove the teachings by regenerating. And eventually he realized that was not the case, that she was suffering and getting worse and worse. And he talks about how he went and he sat down in his favorite chair and he directed his thoughts toward her in her bed. And he said, if you need to go, please don't stay for me and suffer. I let you go gladly. I know that we're together. And a minute later, the doctor walked out and said that she had just died and that before she died, having been so weak she could only speak one word at a time, she suddenly opened her eyes and spoke in her old, and he described it as zestful, gay voice. I had a talk with my boy and everything's okay now. I can leave, and then just died. And so he thought that was the blossoming. But then he felt immediately in the aftermath, in the grief and the feelings of separation, he describes it as, do you know that feeling when you're with someone you love, and maybe you're both reading books and there's a fire on and you just feel each other's presence? And he said, isn't that really what we're after in all the things that we do together when we're in love, whether it's sexuality or it's the activities we do together? We're looking for that feeling of soul contact, of just being there together. And he said, I felt that 10,000 times more powerful from Betty than I'd ever felt it in my life. And it never stopped for the rest of my life. And he said, that convinced me. So he thought, okay, that must be the blossoming. I'll write that down. And then he went around, just as like a year before Pearl Harbor, he went around and his friends wanted him to visit, and so he wouldn't be alone. And he was avoiding all mediumship because he admits later that he was afraid that if they tried to channel Betty and it came out stilted, that it would possibly hurt his faith and reawaken his grief. So he wound up going to the house of these people that were known as Joan and Darby. They had a very famous book called Our Unseen Guest around the time of World War I. And they had been kind of the guides for the whites through this process of discovering mediumship and their experiment. And he insisted that there be no contact with Betty. And Joan said, well, why don't we do a session, but we won't talk to Betty. We'll talk to my spirit. And maybe that'll help you. Maybe they can tell you something that, will make you feel better. He agreed to that. And the second that she went under, Betty stormed in, and he reports that she spent 2.5 hours giving him the most minute details of their lives without a single miss, except one, which was the story about blue slippers. He later found out that he actually had forgotten about the blue slippers, and that too was accurate.
Interesting.
And amazing. So,
well, why don't we?
They,
I'm just time conscious. Why don't we? I want to bring this up to the 60s,
okay.
and kind of the Aquarian age and everything that happened there. Just because I want to make sure we cover as much as we can while in our time.
Yes. So the 1960s, that's when well, we've got Timothy Leary on one hand, who is co-authoring this psychedelic guide to, it's the Tibetan Book of the Dead as reinvented by Evans Wentz, who was sort of the authority at the time. And now we know that in fact, Evans Wentz channeled what he called missing parts.
Is that right?
Yes, of the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
That's so frustrating.
And yeah, and that there were actually many Tibetan books of the dead, that there wasn't like a definitive Tibetan Book of the Dead the way he represents it, that really it's a genre.
What were the parts that he made up?
I don't know the exact ones, but I can recommend you the book. I'll send you a link.
Okay.
And so that's already something, so there's like channeled material in this supposedly Tibetan stuff that is now being reinvented by Leary for use by young hippies who are taking LSD.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still, it's like astrology, that which also exploded in the 1960s, where you have these different systems, even different house systems, and people who are rational point out, how on earth can this stuff work when there's so many different ways of looking at something and none of them agree with each other? And if this one makes sense, then that means that one doesn't. And yet, if you're familiar with astrology and astrologers, you know that all these different systems do work, that for the astrologer for whom they work, it becomes a vehicle where valuable information can be shared. And so it's the same thing, I think, here. It's how can it possibly work when there are these contradictory aspects to it? And so, yes, the Tibetan Book of the Dead really wasn't intended for use by LSD seekers of vision. And yes, the book actually, as presented in English, had channeled parts that weren't really from the Book of the Dead. And yes, Timothy Leary reinvented it along with his co-authors in a way that would be palatable for hippies at the time. And yet many hippies had great trips because of it and had Bardo experiences and were opened up to the ideas of Tibetan Buddhism. And in a weird way, that little book could be seen as opening the door to what would later become this wonderful river of inspiration through publishers like Shambhala, where you were actually getting the Tibetan texts. And so in the 60s, there was this, I think there really was a rejection of the 1950s in that post-war era seemed to have really crystallized a certain conformist attitude about life, and the materialist perspective was at its height, even while the influence of churches was so strong. And there was these vibrant subcultures, writers like we've already mentioned, like Kerouac and Ginsberg, and jazz musicians, and the beginnings of rock and roll with Elvis and Little Richard, and the blues that, Muddy Waters, and which were about to unleash the Rolling Stones and a whole bunch of other bands. And so, but in the 50s, they were down there. They were very much demonized, and everybody knows you couldn't show Elvis's hips on TV. In the 60s, it went crazy. All of a sudden, it was like, show Elvis's hips. We're going to walk around butt naked. The kids seem to just embrace this approach of openness that is so Emerson. It reminds me so much of Emerson saying, why should we have to look at God through the lenses that others have created? Why can't we have a direct relationship with the divine? Are we no better? Aren't we as worthy as the prophets of old to have that kind of spiritual awakening? I mean, that was a pretty ballsy.
That last part's a bit of a logical leap.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's typically American.
Yes, and typically hippie. Interesting. So we talked about Tim Leary, and you mentioned briefly Jim Morrison, but talk about the whole Age of Aquarius thing and the Aquarian gospel, and just that I just remember that I just growing up hearing that people were just fixating on this idea that was left over from the 60s.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's something that we first see it in Dane Rudger is in the area, and this idea that there's an Aquarian age coming is something that is going hand in hand with ideas like, for example, there was an ad, in the Platonist newspaper for a new community that was going to happen in California, where they were going to study the esoterics arts, and it almost sounded like a description of what would later become the Philosophical Research Society, but this was really early in the 1880s. And this was influenced, I think, in part by ideas that had grown up, and that even Blavatsky embraced, that California would be the place that the new root race would arrive, and a new religion would be born there. And this Harold Bloom kind of caustically looked at this, and he said, yeah, the religion that was born there is California Orphism, which is what he called the New Age. And he didn't think much of it. So there's this way that the idea of the Aquarian age through astrology, but also just as a spiritual idea, and the Aquarian gospel of Jesus the Christ had a strong influence on that. And this is a weird story, because there are certainly some tendencies amongst some of the people around the Aquarian gospel that we have to wonder about, and in the sense of, is there racism going on here? Is this just sort of what's going on at the time among people?
Well, it's been shown pretty clearly that if you take those ideas back to theosophy, once you start talking about root races and things like this, you're in profoundly questionable waters.
Absolutely. And so now the creator of the Aquarian gospel was somebody who had tradition going back to the Silver Legion, which was a occult-oriented fascist organization in America during World War II, or just prior to it, that thought Hitler was great. And the leader of the Silver Legion, they used to be called the Silver Shirts as well, was somebody that thought he should be president. And so one of the members of that society who actually owned a silver shirt wound up being the person who created the Aquarian gospel.
Really? Okay, this is a good connection here.
And so now, what is the Aquarian gospel after all? It's very likely the book by Notovovich, right? It's basically saying the same things. That book was already out. That book was written by somebody who claimed that they had seen manuscripts that claimed that Jesus had visited Tibet and India. And so he wrote this into this very controversial book that undoubtedly influenced. There's just too many similarities. But the brilliance was to write these stories down in a format that resembled the Bible, that not only used the language of the Bible, but also had the actual typesetting of Bibles.
Although to be fair, I mean, the Mormons got there first, and
they did,
and yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to interrupt the point. Let's bookmark that real quick. I just wanted to make the side point that one of the things about talking about spirituality in America is that you can't really talk about the most successful examples of it for various reasons. And I'm thinking of, for instance, the Mormon Church or Scientology or Nation of Islam, where they're so either controversial or litigious that it's very hard to talk about them in any type of rational or open way. But those are certainly can't be left out of the conversation, I don't think.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Not to interrupt your point, but
well, so let's continue the story then of what happens with the Aquarian Gospel, which is that you mentioned the Nation of Islam. One of the organizations that was influential for the Nation of Islam had a Bible that was called the Circle 7 Bible. And the Circle 7 Bible included in it whole chapters out of the Aquarian Gospel. And Circle 7 was a separatist, I believe, organization. And in a way, I wonder about the authors of the Aquarian Gospel because of their history. And it's so typically American, so in a way wonderful that the Aquarian Gospel, which is very probably lifted from this other author, winds up being used by the very people that perhaps these authors were trying to exclude, and now it becomes part of their Bible and their belief system, where they want to exclude people like the authors of the Aquarian Gospel. And I find this so American.
Yes.
And so it's a constant theme now, I think, and people, so much has grown from this Aquarian idea. I feel that a lot of the starseed movement is kind of an Aquarian age idea, and there's a constant waiting, which is also very American throughout its history, for this new age to begin.
You think that's a specifically American thing?
No, I mean in fact it's all over the Rosicrucian manifestos, and that kind of expectation is all through Hermeticism. It's
also in the Book of Revelation. So
yes, absolutely, it's a constant theme in all religions. But here, I believe it becomes a kind of a business plan, if you will.
Right. That, I mean, like, say no more. I mean, that's in terms of describing religion in America.
Right. Exactly.
That's great. Okay. Well, I want to talk about the 70s and 80s as well, and we can't miss the whiling out on Mount Shasta. In fact, let's just start with that. I'm super curious about that.
Yeah. Wow. I had. Yeah. Writing about
for people who don't know about this, I mean, maybe just like set the scene as to, the turquoise silk robes and whatnot.
Right. Well, it all starts with a very strange scene where we have someone who is spiritually inspired, and they're out on Mount Shasta hiking, as is their way, and they run into a young person who they say is very beautiful young man, who apparently is Saint Germain. And Saint Germain gives them a sip of an elixir. And Saint Germain says, "You're going to be my designated representative in the world, and you're going to take the teachings out there." And so there is this society that grows up around them, and it's a very strange society in the sense that it's a very insulated cult. And so, for instance, the colors red and black to them represent evil, and so they have these. They're supposed to, whenever they run into this kind of thing, they're supposed to basically curse it and
Okay.
violet is the highest color, and they will use violet lightning or violet bombs to take away the evil black and red.
Cool story, bro.
And and so it's a pretty high anxiety lifestyle.
Well,
There's a story.
if you're triggered by red and black, I mean, you're gonna have a bad time. I hate to break it
Yes,
to
there's
you.
a story.
Or rather,
There's actually a story
common
told.
colors.
There's a story told about this woman walking with a member of the group, and they just see a dress in the window, and the woman is abjuring the dress and cursing it. So
There's a point. There is a point, to be fair, where it's just like, okay, like we're verging into mental illness here. And I shouldn't laugh, because I mean, like we're getting into some serious territory here when people are that far gone.
Well, there's a brainwashing element, and there's also, I think, apophenia is very much there. I think that's also a big part of QAnon.
Absolutely.
And when people
talk about that concept for people who don't know about it. It's really important.
Okay. Apophenia is a compulsion for meaning it often accompanies anxiety and trauma. And so in a traumatic society like the one we're living in right now, where there's all kinds of frightening possibilities and there's deceit all around us and we don't know what to believe, when we fall into a certain belief system that for whatever reason agrees with our prejudices or our predilections, and then we focus our full attention on it, we can receive feelings of rebirth and reassurance that now we are hooked into everything. And what that means, because of apophenia, is that every single thing we see could be a message from some divine source. So this is why in QAnon, they would look at something like, well, the president made this gesture, and that's clearly a message to us of this. And every single little thing, even billboards or a song on the radio. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that a song on the radio or a billboard may not bear a message for someone at a certain moment in time, because people's lives have been changed by things as simple and humble as that, because at the right moment they led to a realization. But this is a compulsion that is highly defensive. So people who do not believe with you become the enemy and are demonized. And people who do believe like you receive a kind of treatment that could be said to resemble the idealized image of what churches are supposed to be like, where everybody's friendly and they bring casseroles for you, and they're so sweet and supportive. And people comment on how when you join the QAnon mentality and the QAnon community, that you get that kind of feeling and that kind of welcome from
I mean,
people.
that's the same for any cult, the love bombing phase.
Yes, absolutely.
And as you're speaking, I'm thinking, I mean, this is just how human beings are normally. It's just exaggerated to a pathological degree at times in a cult environment. Interesting.
Well said.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I'm thinking, just moving up through the 80s, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this. There seemed to be a point, and I'm just thinking this because you were talking about tensegrity earlier. There seemed to be a point in the 80s and 90s where everything became much more corporate. So now, instead of pyramid power in the Aquarian gospel, we have neurolinguistic programming and tensegrity maybe, and things became much more. It took on a new class of metaphors, and now, of course, everything is in computer and internet metaphor. Like, I'm getting downloads is something that you hear people say all the frickin' time, right? And so that's always been interesting to me. But I'm curious. So I maybe bring us up to the current moment in terms of where you think things have come to and where they may be going.
Oh, it's so fascinating. Social media and the internet in general have created such a new environment that is truly different from anything we've seen before. So in a sense, it's the invisible college of the Rosicrucians. And my book could not have been written without this, because it used to be, no longer, unfortunately, but it used to be that Amazon allowed you to search any book that was on Amazon. All the academic books were searchable. that I couldn't have written this book otherwise.
Isn't Google Books, I think, allows at least some of that?
More limited. But Google Books used to be that way too. So between the two of them, and then some of the like academia.edu and some of the other sites like that, I was able to get access to really expensive books and to papers that otherwise I wouldn't have ever heard of. And also because of the internet, I was able to contact these people. And despite the pessimism that I received from most people on the metaphysical side, who said that, oh, you're probably not going to get a very nice welcome from academia with your questions, I received an incredible welcome. They were great.
Oh no, they were great. Okay, I should take
Oh
that
yeah,
back,
no, they were wonderful, Jason. It's mind blowing how generous they were. They time and sending me papers, and I couldn't afford.
I take it back. I'm sorry. I plead for forgiveness.
No, they were so cool. I'm encouraging you to check them out because there's so many wonderful people there.
I was thinking of, just because you said the experience of being dismissed by. I was thinking of other aspects of the powers that be.
Oh well, for sure.
Yeah.
That's a constant battle if you're an esoteric.
Yeah.
And it's a constant battle for academia where they are studying the esoteric. They're also under the same kind of duress.
Yeah, that is not what I was reacting to. I was just reacting to the feeling of, as I'm sure you know well, it's like coming and certainly coming from the background of working with Manly P. Hall. I mean, just like working on this material for decades and decades, and it's the most interesting thing in the world, and it's just like you're dismissed as if you're like a juggler at a party or something like that.
Oh yeah. Well, it is difficult. I mean, it's interesting to see the way that I don't know, who are we talking about here? It's not really the media. I guess it technically is the media. I had so many people tell me, they read the book and they say, people are in the media and they say, oh my God, I love this book. I wish everybody could read it, but no one will ever talk about it where I work. Like no one would touch this with a 10-foot pole.
I think that that's the case, and one of my experiences, kind of doing this stuff more online, is that the internet allows people anonymity and the ability to engage in stuff that they wouldn't be seen doing socially otherwise. So since I kind of see the back end of who's consuming my material, it's pretty much everyone, and I don't think that that's new. I mean, I'm even thinking of, the secret teachings of all ages ended up in a lot of like high places, I think astronauts, politicians, things like that. So it's kind of like, and so esotericism, I feel, is one of those open secrets where it's kind of like sex, where it's like everyone's doing it, but no one's talking about it.
Right. I think that's very true. And in fact, always has been in America. It's just something that even down to this, that today, in the popular imagination, we usually lump alchemy together with witchcraft and it's Halloween stuff. And when we think about somebody like Cotton Mather or the others who were prosecuting and persecuting witches at Salem and other places in New England, we think of them as these very strict Christians. These guys were into the Hermetica. These guys were practicing alchemy.
Cotton Mather.
Yeah.
What the? Okay. You're blowing my mind here. This is so many, you're dropping so many profound mind bombs here in this podcast.
Cotton called John Winthrop the Younger, I've got to get it right. Oh man, it's slipping my mind. Something like the not thrice greatest Hermes, but he referred to him explicitly as in a Hermes or Hermetic way in the eulogy that he wrote for him.
Isn't this frustrating though? I mean, like, I just got to like tangent on this where it's like, I'm sure you share the experience where you're into this stuff and everyone is just so dismissive and like, oh yeah, like whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, you're into magic. It's like, yeah, me and every single other fucking person in history who you know about and has done anything.
Yeah, it is, as you said, the open secret, but it's something that our society has been built to a degree to disempower. And I used to that was Genesis's main point, and maybe that's the deeper point. Well, here's to talk about the 70s and the 80s and onward. Somebody that I love dearly, John Trudell. He if your listeners don't know who he was a an indigenous activist and a wonderful poet, and he was part of the occupation of Alcatraz back in the 1960s. But we had some conversations where he talked about from his indigenous point of view about what he saw as a continuous string of what he called Reichs, and that there was a corporate Reich that was currently in control.
Damn. Okay.
And
all right.
He felt that communism was a kind of Reich, that capitalist industrialized the so-called democracy was a kind of Reich, and that these Reichs were all experimenting with mind control and with population control. And he felt that he called it mining. And he felt that the belief systems, especially the belief in apocalypse and the use of these conformist religions, was to create, to mine our mental energy, to make us willing to put ourselves to work in positions doing things that if we had a soul, we wouldn't do.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I don't love it. You know what I mean? I love that point. I think that's totally true. And I think that's always been true. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, William Burroughs used to write about this a lot, talking about Egypt and the Egyptian and Aztec cultures, and just looking at these things and saying, like, look, man, these things are so obviously fucking control systems, like the Egyptian mythology that people make so much of. It's like, it's exactly what you're just saying. I mean, this is this mythology that is created by a priesthood caste to get slaves to be slaves. And it's just the same now, because that's why no one wants to think about this point, because it's like, you look at Egypt and like all this pomp and circumstance and temple worship and ritual was to a large degree theater for slaves, right? But nobody wants to think about that, because then they have to think about, like, well, that never really changed. You know, it's like, it's so obviously the case now as well, where so much of what we're shown by the media is like this Punch and Judy show that really has like no bearing whatsoever on the real issues.
Right.
So
I love what Du Bois said about it. He had this saying that he said, everywhere the young are offered love or a refrigerator, and everywhere they choose the refrigerator.
Well, refrigeration is a profound thing, though.
It's true. I mean, I actually, as I said it, I thought, well, no, let's not underestimate refrigeration.
Right. I mean,
but on the other hand, we know what he means.
Yeah. I don't know if it's, well, I mean, obviously comfort can be a way that people are controlled, but I think it's deeper than that. I think I think that what you're saying, I mean, the experimentation with mind control, that is nothing new. I mean, people have these sinister ideas about the Illuminati and the New World Order. It's just like, it's a lot simpler and worse than that. It's just like power at its root is interested in power. And I feel that probably all, you know, as we know, studying history, all societies in the world have been built on the back of a slave labor force. And I think there's a lot that goes into this culture of, you know, playing this kind of 3-card Monte game with phrases and terms and shuffling things around so that it doesn't seem that so despite it being exactly what it is, it does not seem that way. And that is a magical thing. And magic as a practice, you know, if you do it yourself, can be hopefully perhaps a liberation from that. And that's one of the reasons I think I agree with you. It tends to be pushed to the sidelines because they want to keep the power for themselves. It's not quite that simple, but you know.
It threatens hierarchy to begin with. And then it opens the floodgate. I mean, I think my book kind of shows it's part of the problem with esoterica, especially in America, is that if you let one little bit of it through, you've got a whole crowd busting through the door. So because people want it, you know. That I think it's a deep human need. Obviously, the need for meaning is the deepest need there is. But also, there's so much fascinating exploration. I used to get the feeling, one of my favorite things to do when I worked for Manly Hall was just to walk into his vault where he had all his best books and manuscripts, and we would have lunch in there and he would answer my questions. And I was working on a bibliography of his alchemical collection at the time under his direction. And when I would look at those books, I would think, wow, like every one of these people was risking their lives most likely to write this stuff down. And they were daring enough to explore this frontier of spirituality and consciousness that was not even allowed at the time. And so to look around at all of these volumes and all of these manuscripts and to feel the sense of all these authors who had to live in fear of being discovered as they tried to experiment with and understand and then capture for posterity, for us, these incredible experiences that they had. And so a huge amount of our heritage, not just as Americans, but as human beings, has been sort of kept from us. And I was just reading one of the academics that I would say is exemplary is Walter Hanegraaff, and he was talking about how he had talked to someone, or was reading a book actually by a scholar in Islam who was arguing that there was some huge amount of materials that have never been explored by scholars of Islam that are occult materials. And
where is this located?
Right? And there's no telling how much of what we think is forever lost might be in there.
That's phenomenal. And that's phenomenal, particularly when you think that in a lot of ways, Western European exchange with Islam is where a lot of this stuff comes from in the first place. Like Sufism and alchemy and things like that. That's fascinating. I got to ask though, I mean, what was Manly Hall like? What was working for him and hanging out with him like?
He was delightful. Such a sweet and humorous and generous human being. It's unbelievable to me that he took a huge risk on me because I had no education in the area. I often say, when I first met him, he was sitting at his desk and he pushed at me this big stack of paper that was a galley for an alchemical bibliography. And I didn't know what a galley was or what alchemy was or what a bibliography was. All my experiences up until that point, and there were very few of them that had anything to do with spirituality, were more in the area of Crowley and Austin Spare. And I was doing things like grabbing William Gray's Tree of Evil because I wanted to practice the evil side. And that's a
great book. I love that book, actually, not for the evil part, but just because that book, it's a profoundly pessimistic and cynical and conservative book. And I think he's right about a lot of this stuff in there.
He has a fascinating, that point of view applied to Kabbalah is really something.
Very acerbic.
He frustrated me because he didn't really present it in a way that I could use it the way I had hoped to.
Right.
And I was basically doing all this because I wanted power. I was somebody who felt I had no social contract because of my childhood, and I had a band that was a nihilist band, and I just wanted it to be successful. I wanted to be powerful. I wanted to spread my nihilist beliefs, and so when he pushed this alchemical biblio in front of me, I mean, unbelievable. I mean, I actually tried to argue that I couldn't do it several times, and he said that he would guide me. He would actually every morning give me work to do, and then check my work in the evening, and I could ask him questions. And it was too amazing an opportunity not to take. And to my shock, I was able to do the work. And we became good friends. I also worked as his screener, which was an amazing experience because he was, in a way, the last hope for many people. And so he was constantly receiving
How do you mean that?
Well, people who had lost their sanity, perhaps, or lost themselves in some way through everything from ceremonial magic to spiritualism anything, they would contact him when they were absolutely desperate, when psychology had failed them and their church had failed them and other spiritual teachers had failed. They would contact him in desperation. And he was limited, and at the time I knew him, he was in his 80s, and he was limited in the amount of time that he could give to situations like that. So he trained me, and then also my wife, Tamara Lucid, to be his screeners. And that was an intense experience. I mean, to see the damage that can be done, and to see what it did to people, and to have to tell people well, no, I'm afraid he can't help you, and to be the one to do that. I mean, he really was trying to show me something that I've never forgotten.
When you say
And
the damage that could be done, do you mean by drugs or what do you mean?
all of it, drugs, by misapplying the principles, by trying to do things for the wrong reasons, just all the classic missteps that people take when they play with power.
I wonder if you can give us some examples, just because what you're saying is so important, and it's always glossed over, always, by people who talk about this. And to some extent, I mean, I get letters from people all the time who are in desperate straits. And I am also extremely limited in what I can do, but people, that is real. I mean, like there are casualties, and I would love if you could talk about that and share some examples, because people do need to hear that.
Okay. Well, examples would include people who explore spiritualism, and then they open doors to entities that torment them. People who have the same experience through the use of ceremonial magic, and they use the banishment ritual and such, but there are entities that attach to them, and they can't get rid of them, and they're tormenting them. And are these entities, are these psychological complexes, what's actually going on there remains an open question, but there's a breakdown of the integrity of the person's psyche. And they have split in some way into this tormenting presence that they try to battle, and then this tormented self that is the victim. And so, in fact, when I asked him once, how would you change your teaching? Like, if you had it all to do again, would you change anything? And he said that he would underemphasize the hidden masters and the Rosicrucian initiates and many of the theosophical approaches, and that he would recommend to people that before they begin practicing spirituality of any kind, but especially something like spiritualism or ceremonial magic, that they acquire some kind of psychological knowledge of themselves.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, Israel Regardie said, do a year of therapy first. And of course, no one ever does that, but it's sound advice.
And there's no reason not to, in the sense that there's so many wonderful books that can be read that can help one to accomplish that. There's so many psychologists, whether you're talking about Jung or I mean, just many choices, depending on what one's proclivities are, who can help you to get a better understanding of self, and also, when things go wrong, can possibly help you to understand what has happened, because so much of it is naivete and inexperience. And as you know, as an experienced practitioner, it takes years to really know your way around yourself.
Yeah.
And yourself is the prism through which you're viewing the rest of it. And so
it takes a long time to really get that also. I mean, you can hear that intellectually, but that takes time.
Right. It's hard it takes time to live it. And so I ran into people who they were obsessed into doing things that ruined their lives, or there were spirits that tormented them so that they couldn't sleep, and it wound up ruining their ability to have a job. And one of them wound up homeless.
That's pretty extreme. I mean, but in a lot of those cases, you do have to. I mean, you have to address potential underlying mental illness also.
Well, I think that is always. I think that what happens is a kind of amplification. So I don't think that healthy people are being destroyed by these practices. I think that people who already have issues are going into practices that amplify them.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think for that reason, it's so important to emphasize that spirituality is not a way to fix yourself, and is absolutely not a way to address mental disturbance or mental illness. There's professionals for that. And luckily we have, I think, much, much, much better tools in our culture now, although they're stretched to the breaking point post-COVID, than we did 100 years ago, or even after World War II, where let's be honest, a lot of people were turning to things like spiritualism or New Thought, or even Scientology as a form of self-treatment, mental health treatment, and that's not necessarily a good idea. I don't think it is a good idea at all, actually.
Right. I'll tell you one thing that I noticed about many of them, which is, I think, a hangover of mainstream American culture, which is that they would become obsessed with the approach that they took as being the only way. And so instead of sampling various approaches and realizing that a lot of this is in a sense metaphorical, they were taking things very literally. And there was like a sense of I'm doing something wrong because I'm not doing it exactly the way I'm supposed to do it.
That's a red flag.
The way it's supposed to be done. And so this creates anxiety. And I'm always reminded by, speaking of Manly Hall, he was one of the first to write about Shingon Buddhism, one of the first in English. And the founder of Shingon, Kukai, has a quote that I just love, which is, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old. Seek what they sought."
That's great. I love that.
I think that really helps, because it helps to reduce some of that anxiety. And also it's something I learned from Manly Hall is like, look, if your sojourn in spiritualism is creating terrible anxiety for you, then leave it and maybe try Zen or try something else, pietism, that see if that makes you, how that makes you feel.
I really like that.
We have that luxury now.
I really like that. It also opens you to reassessing your tool set. It's like, well, if you're just going for the goal instead of potentially these old moribund methods, it's like, well, what are the tools that are available to you to achieve your goals? I mean, there are things that people didn't have access to. Yeah. So I love that. What would Manly Hall tell people, though, who kind of came to him in a state of panic or crisis?
Well, some of them, he had these like little home cures for some things. So, for example, one that he would sometimes let me listen into these sessions so I could learn what to say. And one of them was somebody who had opened a door to some sort of a ghost or entity that was haunting the house. And he used a very simple system. He said, get yourself a red light bulb and a blue light bulb. And he said, 2 lamps. Turn on the red lamp. Look around the room. Look around at the shadows. Feel all the fear that you're feeling. And he said, now, at the same time, turn off the red lamp and turn on the blue one. And he said, the room will be cleansed. So I asked him afterwards, well, what is this? Is this light frequency stuff? Or is this just something you're giving them to do to make them feel better? And he just said, it's something that I've used for people that works. And he said, I don't know if it's because they believe in me, and so because I said it, it's going to work, or if there's something about it intrinsically. But this is something I found that has helped people who are suffering from this situation.
Interesting. Well, it definitely dispels. I mean, that's a way to dispel the shadows and the darkness and things that you're symbolically afraid of. That's interesting.
Yes. And he would also say, he would often remind people that nature is your teacher, that your life is indeed your teacher. So he would say, instead of feeling like there's no help anywhere, and that you're bereft in this universe that's rolling on without you, that in fact the universe is surrounding you with information, with teachers, with opportunities. And if you can just calm down enough, it's like something that Max Heindel used to say when people used to ask him about, well, how come my relative went on and there's no communication, and we're Rosicrucians, shouldn't there be some kind of proof of survival? And Heindel would say, if you throw a stone into a pond, can you see the stone when the pond is rippling? No. But when the pond quiets, then you can see the stone. And he would say they can't contact you while you're so desperate for the contact.
Yeah, I think looking, slowing down and paying attention to what's around you is it's what it's all about.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a lot more profound than it sounds, I think.
It is. It's so true, though. It's right around you. That the simple, daily, humble moments that we cherish, that we take, we constantly think are going to be there forever, and instead of cherishing them by the moment and appreciating what amazing gifts they are, appreciating life, we tend to run off chasing things that our mind presents.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we've passed our 2-hour mark. I think that was a great conversation, though. I'm really grateful to you for going into so much detail and depth. And the book is American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric, and Mystical Traditions of the New World by Ronnie Pontiac. And let us know where we can get the book. I assume it's on Amazon and all of that, and where people can find out.
Barnes and Nobles. I know Intertraditions likes, I think, to have you buy it from them.
They get more.
But if you have a local store, it might be there, and you can certainly order it through them. It's always great to support local businesses.
It is,
and I apologize in advance for the price. I didn't set it. I don't know why it's.
Well, it's a big book. I mean, you're pushing 600 pages. Where can people find out more about you as well?
I just say go to Google and put in Ronnie Pontiac, and you'll find music and films that my wife and I have produced documentary films, and she actually just did one that was nominated. She associate produced a film documentary that was nominated for an Emmy last year that was about the women who were the leaders at Standing Rock. It's a really beautiful film.
Oh, lovely.
And then you'll find our writing and all that. So yeah, just any search engine and you'll be able to find stuff.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and wishing you great success with the book.
Oh, thank you. This was really a great interview. I really appreciate it. And such a pleasure to meet you at long last.
You too. All right. Thanks, Ronnie. Talk to you. All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.